They said the curse would kill anyone who wore that silver bracelet, but what happened to Eliza Thorne in the dead wheat fields of Millbrook Canyon was far worse than any supernatural threat. When the townspeople tied her to that splintered cross and prepared to burn her alive, she whispered 4 words that would haunt a broken cowboy's dreams forever. Go deeper. Make it quick inside. Jack Harlan thought he'd buried his past 20 years ago, along with his wife, and the truth about what really happened in those cursed silver mines. But sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and sometimes the only way to break a curse is to dig up the secrets that created it. The train's whistle cut through the October air like a dying man's scream. Eliza Thorne stepped down onto the weathered platform of Millbrook Canyon, her city boots clicking against wood that had absorbed too much blood over the years. 23 years old, with auburn hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, she carried nothing but a carpet bag and the silver bracelet that glinted on her wrist like captured starlight. The moment that bracelet caught the dying light of day, everything changed. An old woman near the general store gasped, pointing with a shaking finger. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "It's the cursed one. She's brought it back." Before Eliza could ask what she meant, rough hands grabbed her arms. Men she'd never seen before, their faces twisted with fear, and something darker, dragged her toward the dead wheat field beyond town. Her protests were lost in the chaos of barking dogs and panicked voices. "Please, let me go. I don't even know what you're talking about." But fear doesn't listen to reason. Fear only knows how to destroy what it doesn't understand. They bound her to an old wooden cross, its surface scarred with burn marks from previous victims. The silver bracelet caught the last light of day as they wrapped rope around her wrists, and that's when the real terror began. Because this wasn't about superstition or small-town madness. This was about a 20-year-old secret that someone would kill to protect. High on the ridge overlooking that cursed field, a lone figure watched from horseback. Jack Harlan, 58 years old and weathered like an old fence post, had seen this same horror before. 20 years ago, when his own wife burned in what the town called the curse fire. Now the madness was starting again, and he faced a choice that would define what was left of his soul. Ride away and let another innocent die for a lie, or finally face the truth that had been eating him alive for 2 decades. As the townspeople prepared their torches and Eliza's desperate whisper drifted across the night air, Jack Harlan made a decision that would either save them both or damn them all. Because in Millbrook Canyon, some curses run deeper than blood, and the only way to break them is with the truth, no matter how deadly that truth might be. The wind howled across the ridge like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the scent of fear and desperation from the field below. Jack Harlan sat motionless on his horse, a ghost of a man watching ghosts being made. His weathered hands gripped the reins so tight his knuckles had gone white, and his jaw clenched with the kind of pain that comes from watching history repeat itself in the worst possible way. 20 years. 20 goddamn years since he'd watched his wife Margaret burn in what the townspeople called the curse fire. 20 years of telling himself there was nothing he could have done, that some fights weren't worth having, that the truth was too dangerous to dig up. But sitting there, watching them tie that young woman to the same cross where they'd almost burned old widow Henderson 5 years back, Jack knew his time of running was over. The girl, Eliza, he'd heard them call her, didn't look like the type to go down without a fight. Even bound and terrified, there was steel in her spine, defiance in the way she held her chin up against the growing mob. She reminded him of Margaret in that way, the stubborn courage that made frontier women stronger than the men who claimed to protect them. "You expecting trouble?" a voice asked from behind him. Jack didn't turn around. He knew that voice. Tom Bradley, one of the few men in Millbrook Canyon who still remembered Jack from before he became the Ghost Rider, before grief and guilt turned him into a hermit who spoke more to his horse than to people. "Trouble's already here, Tom," Jack replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Question is whether I'm man enough to do something about it this time." Tom rode up beside him, his own eyes fixed on the scene below. "That's Silas Crow's doing. He's been stirring up talk about curses and evil spirits ever since word spread that a Thorne was coming back to town." The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Silas Crow, though 20 years ago he'd gone by Sean Sullivan, back when he owned the silver mines that had collapsed and killed a dozen good people, including Margaret. Silas knows that girl's dangerous to him, Jack said quietly. Not because of any curse, but because she might know the truth about what really happened in those mines. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Jack, you know I was there that night. I saw the cave-in, same as you. It was an accident, pure and simple. Was it? Jack's eyes never left the field below, where the mob was forming a circle around Eliza. Then why did Silas disappear for 5 years after it happened? Why'd he come back with a new name and a story about inheriting money from relatives nobody had ever heard of? Before Tom could answer, a new sound drifted up from the field, Eliza's voice clear and strong despite her terror. If I die here, will it end your curse? The question hit the mob like a slap. For a moment, even from their perch on the ridge, Jack could see them hesitate, because deep down they all knew the same thing Jack had figured out years too late. There was no curse. There was only guilt and fear and the terrible weight of covering up the truth. That girl's got more backbone than the lot of them combined, Tom muttered. Jack finally turned to look at his old friend. Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. That night Margaret died. Did you really believe it was an accident? Tom's face went pale in the moonlight. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then so quietly, Jack almost missed it. No, I never did. Then why didn't you say something? Because I was scared, Jack. We all were. Silas had money, influence, connections with the territorial government. Who was going to believe a bunch of miners over a man like that? Down in the field, someone had lit a torch. Orange flames flickered across Eliza's face, and Jack could see the terror in her eyes. But he could also see something else. The same fierce determination that had drawn him to Margaret all those years ago. Well, I'm done being scared, Jack said, checking his rifle. And I'm done letting innocent people pay for other men's crimes. Tom grabbed his arm. Jack, you can't take on the whole town. There's got to be 30 men down there. Maybe more. Then I guess I'd better not miss. Jack spurred his horse forward, starting down the rocky slope toward the field. Behind him, Tom called out, "You're going to get yourself killed." Probably, Jack called back without slowing down, but at least I won't die a coward. The descent from the ridge took longer than he would have liked. By the time he reached level ground, the mob had grown larger and more agitated. He could hear their voices now, a mixture of righteous anger and barely controlled fear. She's brought the curse back. My crops have been failing ever since word came she was on her way. The spirits won't rest until we send her back to hell where she belongs. Jack had heard it all before, 20 years ago. The same desperate need to blame someone, anyone, for their troubles. The same willingness to believe in supernatural evil rather than face the human evil that actually threatened them. He rode slowly around the edge of the crowd, staying in the shadows, counting men and weapons. Most of them carried farming tools or hunting rifles. Dangerous enough in a mob, but not military-grade firepower. A few had torches, and one man near the front carried what looked like a can of kerosene. They really were planning to burn her alive. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized more faces in the crowd. Men he'd known for decades, some he'd considered friends. Fear had turned them into something unrecognizable, something monstrous, but it was what happened next that made his decision for him. A woman near the back of the crowd, Sarah Mackenzie, whose husband had died in the mine collapse alongside Margaret, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "This ain't right," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I don't care what curse that girl might carry. This ain't who we are." The response was swift and brutal. 2 men grabbed Sarah, dragging her away from the crowd while others shouted about curse sympathizers and devil worshippers. Jack watched in horror as they threw the widow to the ground, one of them raising his boot to kick her. That's when Jack Harlan stopped being the Ghost Rider and became something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. His rifle shot cracked across the field like thunder splitting the sky. Sharp, clean, final. The mob froze, their torches wavering in suddenly unsteady hands. From the darkness beyond the wheat field, Jack rode in slow and deliberate, his hat low, his Winchester resting easy in weathered hands that had forgotten how to shake. "Evening, folks," he said conversationally, as if he'd just encountered them at a church social rather than a mob execution. "Lovely night for a lynching, wouldn't you say?" The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, fear replacing bloodlust in their eyes. Because they all knew who he was, and they all remembered what he'd been capable of before grief broke him down to nothing. "Jack Harlan," someone whispered, "the Ghost Rider." "That's right," Jack replied, never breaking stride as he rode toward the cross where Eliza was bound. "And ghosts don't much like being disturbed." But as he raised his rifle and prepared to face down the entire town of Millbrook Canyon, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Because somewhere in that crowd, Silas Crow was watching and planning, and a man who'd killed once to protect his secrets wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The real battle for Eliza Thorne's life, and the truth about Millbrook Canyon's curse, was just getting started. The silence that followed Jack's entrance stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 30 men stood frozen in the flickering torchlight, their faces a mixture of fear, shame, and the kind of desperate anger that comes from being caught in the act of something unforgivable. Jack kept his rifle trained on the crowd, his finger resting easy on the trigger, while his eyes swept the faces of people he'd once called neighbors. "Now then," Jack said, his voice carrying that lazy drawl that old-timers knew meant deadly serious business, "I'd like someone to explain to me why good Christian folk are fixing to burn a young woman alive on nothing more than superstition and fear." A man near the front of the crowd, Bill Henderson, whose wife had nearly met the same fate 5 years earlier, stepped forward with his hands raised. "Jack, you don't understand. That bracelet she's wearing, it's the same one that brought the curse 20 years ago? The same one that what, Bill?" Jack's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Killed your brother in the mine collapse? Made your crops fail? Turned your milk sour?" He shook his head grimly. "Or maybe it just made you forget that real men caused your troubles, and it's easier to blame a piece of jewelry than face the truth." From somewhere in the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "You weren't there, Harlan. You didn't see what happened when that Indian woman wore it." Jack's blood turned to ice. "What Indian woman?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Jack saw several men exchange nervous glances. Finally, old Pete Morrison spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Thorne, the girl's grandmother. She worked in the mines before the accident." "Before the murder, you mean?" The words came from Eliza, spoken with a clarity that cut through the night like a church bell. Every head turned toward her, bound to the cross but somehow managing to project more authority than any of the armed men surrounding her. "My grandmother didn't die in any mine collapse," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She escaped that night and lived to tell me the truth about what really happened, about who really killed those miners." A ripple of unease went through the crowd. Jack could see the fear in their eyes changing, transforming from supernatural dread to something more immediate and dangerous, the fear of exposure. "Shut her up," someone hissed from the back. "Don't let her speak that devil talk." But Jack had heard enough. In one fluid motion, he swung down from his horse and strode toward the cross, rifle still at the ready. The crowd parted before him like he was carrying plague, none of them willing to be the first to challenge a man whose reputation had grown larger than life during his years of self-imposed exile. "Step back," he ordered, and they did. Jack pulled out his knife and began cutting through the ropes that bound Eliza's wrists. As the hemp fell away, she nearly collapsed, her legs numb from being tied so long. Jack caught her before she could fall, his arm surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he'd been carved from desert stone. "Easy there, miss," he said softly. "You're safe now." But as he helped her stand, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Eliza's knees buckled, and as she fell against him, her lips came close to his ear. What she whispered then made his blood run cold. "Go deeper. Make it quick inside." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd heard them before, 20 years ago, spoken by his dying wife as they pulled her broken body from the collapsed mine shaft. Margaret's final words, which he'd assumed were the delirium of a woman in shock. But hearing them now from the lips of Sarah Thorne's granddaughter, Jack realized they weren't random babbling at all. They were instructions, a message passed down through 20 years of silence, from grandmother to granddaughter, waiting for someone who would understand their meaning. "Where did you learn those words?" Jack whispered urgently. Eliza's eyes met his, and in them he saw not confusion, but the fierce intelligence of a woman carrying a terrible burden. "From my grandmother's journal," she breathed, "the one she kept hidden for 20 years. The one that tells the truth about the Millbrook Canyon silver mines." Before Jack could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the field. The crowd began to scatter like startled birds, some heading back toward town, others melting into the darkness beyond the wheat field. But Jack kept his rifle ready because he recognized the sound of those particular hoofbeats. Silas Crow was coming. 3 riders materialized from the darkness, their horses moving with the kind of precision that spoke of military training or long years of riding together. The lead rider was tall and imposing, his silver hair gleaming in the torchlight, his expensive coat marking him as a man of means in a land where most folks wore homespun cloth. "Well, well," Silas said, as he reined in his horse 20 feet from where Jack stood protecting Eliza. "Jack Harland, I heard you'd gone completely mad, living up in those hills like a hermit. Didn't expect to see you playing hero again." "Silas," Jack's voice was flat, emotionless. "Or do you prefer Sean Sullivan these days? Sometimes a man forgets which name he's using to hide from his crimes." The 2 men flanking Silas shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their guns. But Silas himself just smiled, the cold, calculating smile of a man who'd learned to kill without conscience. "Ancient history, my friend. I'm more interested in present problems." His eyes fixed on Eliza, and Jack could see the hunger there. Not sexual, but something darker. The hunger of a predator who'd spotted prey that could destroy him if left alive. "The girl's got something that doesn't belong to her," Silas continued. "That bracelet's been nothing but trouble since the day it first showed up in this town. Best thing for everyone would be if it disappeared permanently." "Funny thing about that," Eliza said, stepping forward despite Jack's protective gesture. "My grandmother always said this bracelet was a map, a way to find something that certain people would kill to keep hidden." Silas's smile faltered for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, but Jack caught it. In that instant, he saw not the confident mine owner, but the scared young man who'd watched a dozen people die and decided to cover it up rather than face justice. "Maps can lead people to dangerous places," Silas said quietly. "Sometimes it's better to stay lost." That's when one of his men made the mistake of reaching for his gun. Jack's rifle was up and aimed before the man's hand cleared leather. The sound of the hammer cocking seemed unnaturally loud in the desert air. "I wouldn't," Jack said conversationally. "I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me a very dangerous man to threaten." For a long moment, the tableau held, Jack with his rifle trained on Silas's gunman, Eliza standing beside him with the silver bracelet gleaming on her wrist like a beacon, and Silas himself calculating the odds of walking away from this confrontation alive. Then Silas made his choice. With a sharp whistle, he wheeled his horse around and rode back into the darkness, his men following close behind. But as they disappeared beyond the wheat field, his parting words drifted back on the night wind. "This isn't over, Harland. That girl's carrying more danger than you know. And when it catches up to her, anyone standing too close is going to burn." After they were gone, Jack lowered his rifle and turned to Eliza. She was staring at the spot where Silas had vanished, her face pale but determined. "He's right about one thing," she said quietly. "I am carrying danger. The question is whether you're brave enough to help me use it." Jack looked at this young woman who'd nearly been burned alive for wearing her grandmother's jewelry, who'd whispered his dead wife's final words, who stood defiant in the face of threats that would have sent most men running for the hills. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt something he'd thought was dead forever: purpose. "Miss," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I reckon it's time you told me exactly what your grandmother wrote in that journal. Because if we're going to take down Silas Crow, we're going to need every weapon we can get." As they walked toward his horse, Eliza's hand unconsciously touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. "She called it blood silver," she said, "metal pulled from the earth with murder and lies. She said it would call out for justice until the truth was finally told. Jack helped her mount behind him, his mind already racing with possibilities. 20 years of running from the past was over. Now it was time to dig up the truth, no matter how deep it was buried or how many people had died to keep it hidden. But as they rode toward his cabin in the hills, neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the edge of the wheat field. Silas Crow hadn't gone far, and he'd heard every word of their conversation. The game of cat and mouse was about to begin, and in Millbrook Canyon, that game always ended in blood. Jack's cabin sat in a grove of pines 3 miles up canyon from town, hidden from the main trail by a bend in the creek and 20 years of deliberate isolation. It was a modest place, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows positioned to give clear sight lines in all directions. The kind of home built by a man who'd learned to sleep with one eye open and both ears alert for trouble. As they approached the cabin, Eliza could see why the townspeople called Jack the Ghost Rider. He moved through the landscape like he was part of it, reading every shadow and listening to every sound the wind carried. This wasn't just a man who lived alone. This was a man who'd learned to survive alone, which was an entirely different skill. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the kind of solitude that settles into a place when it's occupied by someone who's forgotten how to expect company. Jack lit a lantern and gestured for Eliza to sit at the rough-hewn table while he built up the fire. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a dented pot. "Please." Eliza set her carpet bag on the table and began rummaging through it. "I need to show you something." What she pulled out made Jack's hands freeze on the coffee pot. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. But it was the Cherokee symbols burned into the leather that made his breath catch. The same symbols that decorated the silver bracelet on her wrist. "My grandmother's journal," Eliza said quietly. "She wrote it in 3 languages, English, Cherokee, and Spanish. She said that way, if one part was found and destroyed, the others might survive." Jack poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm tin. "What does it say?" Eliza opened the journal carefully, revealing pages covered in precise handwriting. "It starts the night of the mine collapse, October 15th, 1855. She was working the night shift in Shaft 7 when she heard the explosions." Explosions? Jack's eyes narrowed. The official report said it was a structural collapse caused by unstable rock formations. That's what they wanted people to believe. Eliza began reading from the journal, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The white man Sullivan came to the mine at midnight with 3 others. They carried cases of dynamite and spoke in whispers about clearing out the Cherokee burial chamber in the deepest part of Shaft 7. Jack's coffee cup hit the table harder than he intended. Burial chamber? The silver vein ran directly through sacred Cherokee ground. Ancient burial sites that had been there for centuries before the first white man ever set foot in this territory." Eliza turned a page, her finger tracing the careful script. "Sullivan said the bones and artifacts were slowing down the mining operation, said they needed to blast them out of the way so they could get to the pure silver underneath." The pieces began falling into place in Jack's mind, like dominoes toppling in sequence. So he dynamited the burial chamber. But something went wrong. The explosions were bigger than he planned. They brought down half the mine. Eliza's voice grew thick with emotion. 12 men were trapped in the collapse. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. They weren't all killed by falling rocks. She turned to another page, where the handwriting became more frantic, the words running together as if written in desperate haste. "I hid in the ventilation shaft and watched through a crack in the rocks. Sullivan and his men found the survivors. 3 men still alive, trapped but breathing. And Sullivan, he shot them, one by one. Said dead men tell no tales about sacred ground." Jack's hands clenched into fists. "Margaret. Where was Margaret?" "She was in the side tunnel, trying to dig out 2 of the trapped miners." Eliza's voice became a whisper. "Your wife died a hero, Mr. Harlan. She was trying to save lives when the secondary collapse buried her." For a long moment, Jack couldn't speak. 20 years of guilt and self-recrimination crashed over him like a dam bursting. He'd spent 2 decades believing Margaret had died because of his failures, his inability to keep her safe. Now he learned she died because of one man's greed and another man's murder. "There's more," Eliza said gently, "about what happened after." She turned to the final entry in the journal, where the handwriting was shaky and desperate. "Sullivan found me before I could escape. Put his gun to my head and said I had two choices: keep quiet about what I saw or join the others in their graves. I told him I'd rather die than let him get away with murder. He laughed and said dying was too easy. He was going to let me live with the knowledge that I could have stopped him, but chose not to. But she did escape." She pretended to agree to his terms. Then, when he wasn't watching, she grabbed a piece of the sacred Cherokee silver from the burial chamber, a bracelet worn by a Cherokee chief's daughter who died defending this land from Spanish conquistadors 300 years ago. Eliza held up her wrist, where the silver gleamed in the lantern light. "This bracelet," she said, "the spirits of the ancestors would guide her to justice, even if it took generations." Jack stared at the bracelet with new understanding. "That's why the town fears it. Not because it's cursed, but because it represents the truth they've been running from for 20 years. My grandmother spent the rest of her life documenting Sullivan's crimes. She traced his new identity when he returned as Silas Crow. She discovered that the money he claimed to inherit came from selling sacred Cherokee artifacts on the black market, artifacts he'd stolen from the burial chamber before destroying it." Before Jack could respond, a sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching fast through the trees. Jack was at the window in seconds, rifle in hand. "4 riders," he said grimly, "and they're not here for a social call." Eliza quickly stuffed the journal back into her carpet bag. "Is there another way out?" "Back door leads to the creek. From there, you can follow the water downstream to where it meets the main trail." Jack checked his ammunition, his movements quick and efficient. "But they'll have that covered too." A voice called out from the darkness. "Harland, we know you're in there. Send out the girl and we'll let you live." Jack recognized the voice. Deputy Marshal Pete Hawkins, one of Silas Crow's paid men, which meant this wasn't just vigilante justice anymore. This was official law enforcement, corrupted and bought. "What's it going to be, Jack?" Hawkins called out. "You gonna die for some stranger who's brought nothing but trouble to our town?" Jack looked at Eliza, seeing in her face the same determination that had drawn him to Margaret all those years ago. The same refusal to back down in the face of injustice. The same willingness to fight for what was right even when the odds were impossible. "Miss Thorne," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. That journal of your grandmother's, does it contain enough evidence to bring down Silas Crow?" "More than enough. Names, dates, locations, even a map showing where he hid the Cherokee artifacts he stole." She met his eyes without flinching. "But only if we can get it to someone honest enough to act on it. The territorial marshal in Silver Creek is an honest man, Thomas Wade. He's been trying to build a case against Crow for years, but could never find witnesses willing to testify." Outside, the sound of men moving through the trees grew closer. They had maybe 2 minutes before the cabin was surrounded completely. "There's a hidden compartment under the floorboards in the back room," Jack said, making his decision. "You can hide there until they're gone, then make your way to Silver Creek with that journal." "What about you?" Jack's smile was grim as winter wind. "I'm going to give them what they came for, just not the way they expect." He walked to the front door and called out, "Hawkins, you want to talk? Let's talk. But man to man, no hiding in the trees like cowards. Send out the girl first." "She's not here." Rode on through an hour ago, heading south toward Adobe Wells. There was a pause, then the sound of whispered consultation. Jack used the time to help Eliza into the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. It was cramped and airless, but it would keep her safe until the immediate danger passed. "Whatever happens," he whispered as he replaced the floorboards, "don't come out until you're sure they're gone. Then get that journal to Marshal Wade. Make sure the truth finally comes to light." The front door exploded inward just as Jack finished hiding the evidence of Eliza's presence. 4 men burst into the cabin, guns drawn, led by Deputy Hawkins and his cold, calculating eyes. "Where is she, Jack?" "I told you." "She's not here." Hawkins backhanded him across the face, the blow splitting Jack's lip and filling his mouth with the taste of blood. Wrong answer. We know she came here with you. Now where is she? Jack spat blood onto the floor and smiled. You're going to have to do better than that, Pete. I've been hit by meaner men than you. What followed was methodical and brutal. They turned the cabin upside down, searching every corner, every hiding place they could find. They beat Jack when he refused to answer their questions, and they beat him when he did answer, but not to their satisfaction. But they never found the hidden compartment, and they never found Sarah Thorne's journal. After an hour of fruitless searching, Hawkins finally gave up. We'll be watching you, Harland. Day and night. That girl surfaces anywhere in this territory. We'll know about it. After they rode away, Eliza emerged from her hiding place to find Jack slumped in a chair, his face bloody but his eyes still defiant. They're gone, he said thickly through swollen lips. But they'll be back. And next time, they won't be so gentle. Eliza helped him clean his wounds, her hands gentle but her resolve hardening with each drop of blood she wiped away. We can't wait for them to regroup. We need to get that journal to Marshal Wade tonight. Jack nodded, despite the pain it caused. There's an old mining trail that leads over the ridge to Silver Creek. It's dangerous at night, but it's the only route they won't be watching. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been Jack's sanctuary for 20 years, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line. Silas Crow had come to see the results of his deputy's work, and what he'd seen had filled him with a cold certainty. The journal had to be destroyed, and everyone who'd read it had to die. Tonight, the final hunt was about to begin. The old mining trail to Silver Creek was little more than a goat path carved into the mountainside, treacherous even in daylight and potentially deadly after dark. But as Jack and Eliza picked their way carefully along the narrow ledge, both knew it was their only chance of reaching Marshal Wade alive. The main roads would be crawling with Silas Crow's men by now, and staying in Millbrook Canyon meant certain death. Jack's horse, a sure-footed mountain mare named Luna, carried them both with careful precision, her hooves finding purchase on rocks that seemed too small to support a cat, let alone a horse and two riders. Behind them, the lights of Millbrook Canyon twinkled like fallen stars, deceptively peaceful for a town harboring 20 years of murder and corruption. How much further? Eliza whispered, her arms wrapped around Jack's waist as they navigated a particularly narrow section of trail. 4 miles to the pass, then another 6 down to Silver Creek. Jack's voice was strained, both from the pain of his beating and from the concentration required to guide Luna safely through the darkness. We should reach Marshal Wade's office by dawn, assuming. The crack of a rifle cut through the night air, and rock chips exploded from the cliff face inches from Jack's head. Luna shied, her hooves dancing dangerously close to the edge as echoes bounced off the canyon walls. They found us, Jack said grimly, spurring Luna forward as more shots rang out behind them. The pursuit had begun in earnest. Silas Crow hadn't waited for his deputy to regroup. He'd organized his own hunting party, men who knew these mountains as well as Jack did and had no qualms about shooting 2 people off a cliff to protect their employer's secrets. How many? Eliza asked, turning to look back down the trail. Too many. Jack could see the bobbing lights of at least 6 lanterns following them up the mountain path, and they're gaining ground. Luna was brave and sure-footed, but she was carrying double weight on a trail that challenged even an unloaded horse. Their pursuers, riding fresh mounts and carrying only weapons, had the advantage of speed. It would be a close race to the pass, and if they didn't make it, another shot rang out, closer this time. The bullet whistled past Eliza's ear so close she could feel the wind of its passage. One of Crow's men had a rifle with good range and was getting their distance. Jack, Eliza said urgently, there's something else in my grandmother's journal. Something I didn't tell you back at the cabin. Now might not be the best time for reading, Jack replied through gritted teeth as he guided Luna around a hairpin turn that dropped off into empty space. She drew a map, not just of the mine, but of every place Silas hid Cherokee artifacts over the years, including a cache in a cave system near the pass we're heading for. Jack's hands tightened on the reins. You think we can lose them in the caves? I think we can do better than that. According to the map, there's a passage that comes out on the other side of the mountain, near an old abandoned mining camp. If we can reach it, we can circle back and hit Silver Creek from an unexpected direction. Jack nodded, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. But first we have to survive the next hour. As if summoned by his words, the sound of galloping hooves echoed from the trail behind them. Their pursuers had abandoned caution for speed, pushing their horses hard up the treacherous path. It was a calculated risk. They might lose a horse and rider to the darkness, but they'd certainly catch their quarry before the pass. Luna was beginning to labor, her breathing heavy from the climb and the double burden. Foam flecked her muzzle, and Jack could feel the tremor of exhaustion in her powerful muscles. She was giving everything she had, but even mountain horses had limits. "There," Eliza said suddenly, pointing to a break in the cliff face barely visible in the starlight. "That should be the cave entrance." Jack steered Luna toward what looked like solid rock, trusting to Eliza's grandmother's map-making skills and their own desperate need for shelter. As they drew closer, he could see it, a narrow opening in the stone, just wide enough for a horse and rider if they dismounted and led the animal through. Behind them, the pursuing lights were gaining fast. Maybe 10 minutes before they reached this spot, which meant Jack and Eliza had that long to disappear into the mountain's heart. They dismounted quickly, and Jack led Luna through the cave entrance while Eliza grabbed handfuls of loose rock to scatter across their tracks. It wasn't perfect camouflage, but in the darkness it might buy them precious minutes. Inside the cave, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Their breath misted in the lantern light as they moved deeper into the mountain, following what appeared to be a natural corridor carved by underground water over countless centuries. The floor was smooth stone, worn to glass-like polish, and their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. "Your grandmother explored this place," Jack asked quietly, impressed despite their desperate circumstances. "She spent 3 years mapping every cave system within 50 miles of Millbrook Canyon. She said the mountains held the memories of her people, and someone needed to remember where the sacred places were hidden." They moved deeper into the cave network, Luna following trustingly behind them despite her obvious unease with the enclosed space. The lantern light revealed chambers that opened like cathedrals, their walls glittering with mineral deposits that caught and reflected the flame like captured starlight. But it was what they found in the third chamber that made them both stop and stare in amazement. Cherokee artifacts filled the space like a museum exhibit. Pottery, jewelry, weapons, ceremonial masks. Hundreds of irreplaceable pieces stacked carelessly in wooden crates, as if they were common trade goods rather than sacred relics of a proud people. "This is where he's been hiding them," Eliza breathed, moving among the crates with something approaching reverence. "All the pieces he stole from the burial chamber before he destroyed it." Jack examined some of the artifacts, his weathered hands careful not to damage pieces that had survived centuries, only to be looted by a greedy mine owner. "There's enough here to fill a museum, or to make a man very rich selling to private collectors back east." "Look at this," Eliza said from the far corner of the chamber. She was kneeling beside an ornate wooden chest, its surface carved with Cherokee symbols and inlaid with silver. This wasn't just stolen from any burial site. According to the symbols, this belonged to a Cherokee princess, a woman named Atsila, who died defending this valley from Spanish soldiers 300 years ago. As she spoke, Eliza opened the chest to reveal the most beautiful piece of craftsmanship Jack had ever seen. It was a ceremonial dress made from white buckskin and decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of Atsila's life and heroic death. But what caught Jack's attention was the silver bracelet lying atop the dress, identical to the one Eliza wore, but clearly much older. "The original," Eliza whispered. "My grandmother's bracelet was a copy she made from memory. This is the actual bracelet worn by Princess Atsila." Jack was about to respond when the sound of voices echoed from the cave entrance. Their pursuers had found the opening and were preparing to follow them into the mountain's depths. "How far to the other exit?" Jack asked urgently. Eliza consulted her grandmother's journal, tracing the map with her finger. "Half a mile through 2 more chambers. But Jack, we can't just leave these artifacts here. If Silas's men find this cache, they'll destroy everything to cover their tracks," Jack finished grimly. "Can't have evidence of their boss's grave robbing lying around." The voices were getting closer, along with the flickering light of approaching torches. They had maybe 5 minutes before the hunters reached this chamber. That's when Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She lifted Princess Atzila's bracelet from the chest and slipped it onto her other wrist, alongside her grandmother's reproduction. The moment the two pieces of silver touched, something extraordinary happened. The cave filled with a sound like wind through autumn leaves, and for just an instant, both Jack and Eliza could swear they saw the ghostly figure of a Cherokee woman standing among the artifacts, her eyes blazing with centuries of accumulated rage. "Atzila," Eliza whispered, and the ghostly figure nodded once before fading back into shadow. But the bracelets continued to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected lantern flame. And suddenly Eliza knew exactly what they had to do. "The sacred silver calls to its own," she said, her voice filled with new certainty. "My grandmother was right. The spirits of the ancestors won't rest until justice is served and their treasures are returned to sacred ground." Jack stared at the glowing bracelets, his practical mind warring with evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're not just carrying evidence of Silas Crow's crimes anymore. We're carrying the accumulated power of every Cherokee soul he's wronged." Eliza's eyes met his, blazing with the same fierce determination he'd seen in her grandmother's journal. "And it's time to use that power to end this once and for all." The sound of approaching boots echoed through the cave system, getting closer with each passing second. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Jack Harlan wasn't running from a fight. He was preparing to finish one. The glow from the twin bracelets cast dancing shadows on the cave walls as Jack and Eliza prepared for what might be their final stand. The Cherokee artifacts seemed to pulse with sympathetic energy, as if responding to the presence of Princess Atzila's sacred silver. Even Luna, normally steady as granite, shifted nervously, her ears flicking at sounds only she could hear. "How many bullets do you have?" Eliza asked quietly, checking the small derringer she'd pulled from her carpet bag. "Enough," Jack replied, though they both knew that against 6 armed men in a confined space, ammunition would run out long before their enemies did. "But I don't think this is going to be decided by gunfire." As if summoned by his words, the first of their pursuers appeared at the chamber entrance. It was Deputy Hawkins, his face twisted with greed as he took in the fortune in Cherokee artifacts surrounding them. "Well, I'll be damned," Hawkins breathed. "Crow never told us about this little treasure trove." Behind him, 5 more men crowded into the chamber, their weapons trained on Jack and Eliza, but their eyes drinking in the priceless relics that filled every corner of the space. These weren't lawmen anymore. They were thieves who'd stumbled onto the biggest score of their lives. "Drop your weapons," Hawkins ordered, though his attention was clearly divided between his prisoners and the fortune surrounding them. "Mr. Crow wants to have a conversation with both of you." "I'll bet he does," Jack said dryly. "Question is whether we'll survive that conversation. That depends entirely on how cooperative you're feeling." Hawkins stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the glowing bracelets on Eliza's wrists. "Those are pretty pieces of jewelry, miss. Shame it would be if something happened to them." That's when Eliza did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward, raised her arms so the bracelets caught the light, and began to speak in Cherokee. Words her grandmother had taught her as a child, words she'd never fully understood until this moment. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the cave plummeted, their breath misting in air that had been warm moments before. The lanterns flickered as if touched by an impossible wind, and somewhere in the depths of the mountain, a sound began. Low, rhythmic, like the beating of a great heart. "What the hell is she doing?" one of the men whispered, his gun wavering as he looked around the chamber with growing fear. But Hawkins was made of sterner stuff. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at Eliza's heart. "I don't care if you're speaking in tongues, lady. You're coming with us, and those bracelets are coming off your wrists, permanently." He pulled the trigger. The bullet should have killed Eliza instantly. Instead, it struck something invisible in the air between them and ricocheted harmlessly into the cave wall. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by that rhythmic beating, which was growing louder with each passing second. "Impossible," Hawkins snarled, firing again with the same result. "Witchcraft." That's when the Cherokee spirits made their presence known. They materialized slowly at first, translucent figures emerging from the shadows between the artifact crates. Warriors in war paint and ceremonial dress, women carrying children, elders with faces carved by a lifetime of wisdom and sorrow. All of them bore the wounds that had killed them, bullet holes, knife cuts, the terrible marks of a people systematically exterminated by greed and hatred. But at their head stood a figure that made even Jack's breath catch. Princess Atsila herself, tall and proud and blazing, with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the physical world. She wore the white buckskin dress from the chest, and her eyes held the accumulated rage of 3 centuries of injustice. Jesus Christ, one of Hawkins' men whimpered, dropping his gun and backing toward the cave entrance. They're real. The curse is real. Stand your ground, Hawkins roared, but his own voice cracked with terror as the ghostly figures began to advance. They're just illusions, tricks of the light. The spirits said nothing. They didn't need to. Their very presence was judgment enough for men who'd spent their lives stealing from the dead and murdering the innocent. One by one, Hawkins' men broke and ran, their courage evaporating like morning mist in the face of spiritual vengeance. But Hawkins himself stood firm, his gun trained on Eliza with the desperate determination of a man who'd gone too far to turn back. I don't care how many ghosts you can conjure, girl. You're still flesh and blood dies when you put enough bullets in it. He fired again, emptying his cylinder in a desperate fusillade that should have cut Eliza down. But the bullets passed through her as if she were made of smoke, while the bracelets on her wrists blazed with light that filled the entire chamber. That's when Jack understood what was happening. The spirits weren't just protecting Eliza. They were using her as a conduit, transforming her into something more than human. She was becoming the vessel for their accumulated power, the instrument of their long-delayed justice. Go deeper, Eliza said, but her voice carried harmonics that belonged to dozens of Cherokee souls. Make it quick inside. The silver remembers every drop of blood spilled in its taking. Hawkins fumbled for fresh ammunition, his hands shaking so badly he could barely reload. Stay back! I'm warning you! But Princess Atsila was already moving, her ghostly form flowing across the chamber like mist given shape and purpose. When she touched Hawkins, he screamed, not with physical pain, but with the agony of a soul confronting every evil act it had ever committed. He saw Margaret Harlan dying in the mine collapse, calling out for help that never came. He saw the Cherokee families driven from their ancestral lands, their children crying as sacred burial grounds were dynamited for silver. He saw Silas Crow putting bullets in the heads of wounded miners, their blood seeping into earth that had known peace for 1,000 years. All of it flooded through Hawkins' consciousness in a single, devastating moment. The weight of accumulated guilt and horror was more than any human mind could bear. He collapsed to his knees, his weapon forgotten, tears streaming down his face as he whispered broken apologies to ghosts who had waited 3 centuries to hear them. But even as justice was served in the depths of the mountain, a new threat was approaching. The sound of horses and shouting voices echoed from the cave entrance. Silas Crow himself, leading a larger force of men who'd been alerted by the gunshots and the screams of the fleeing hunters. Eliza, Jack said urgently, we need to go. Now. But when he looked at her, he wasn't sure the woman he'd rescued from the burning cross still existed. The bracelets had transformed her into something else, a living bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, through which the accumulated power of her ancestors flowed like a river of silver fire. The truth must be told, she said in that voice that belonged to many souls. The stolen treasures must be returned. The blood debt must be paid in full. And it will be, Jack promised, taking her hand despite the supernatural energy crackling around her. But first we have to survive long enough to make sure it happens. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the cave system, accompanied by Silas Crow's voice shouting orders to his men. They had minutes, maybe less, before the chamber was overrun by killers who'd shoot first and worry about ghosts later. That's when Princess Atsila turned to Jack, her ancient eyes meeting his with something that might have been approval. She spoke a single word in Cherokee, and suddenly he understood what had to be done. The other exit, he said to Eliza. We take the artifacts with us. All of them. That's impossible. There are hundreds of pieces and we only have one horse. Not all of them, Jack corrected, his eyes fixed on the ornate chest that had held Princess Atzila's dress. Just the most important ones. The pieces that carried the strongest spiritual power. As understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes, the Cherokee spirits began to move with purpose, selecting specific artifacts from the vast collection. A war lance carried by a chief who died defending his village from Spanish soldiers. A medicine bag worn by a shaman who'd been burned at the stake for refusing to convert to Christianity. A child's toy carved by a father who'd watched his family die of smallpox, brought by white traders. Each piece pulsed with its own inner light as the spirits touched it, marking it as essential to the great reckoning that was coming. And as Jack and Eliza loaded the chosen artifacts onto Luna's back, the mountain itself seemed to sigh with anticipation. The final confrontation with Silas Crow was at hand, but this time Jack Harlan wouldn't be facing him alone. This time he'd have the combined power of 3 centuries of Cherokee souls standing beside him, ready to reclaim what was stolen and avenge what was lost. The hunt was about to become a reckoning. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the cave system like a drumbeat of doom as Jack and Eliza made their desperate escape through the mountain's heart. Behind them, loaded with the most sacred Cherokee artifacts, Luna moved with supernatural sure-footedness through passages that seemed to part before them like the Red Sea. The twin bracelets on Eliza's wrist cast an eerie silver light that illuminated their path while the spirits of 3 centuries guided their steps. "There," Eliza said, pointing ahead to where starlight filtered through a narrow opening. "The exit to the old mining camp." They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness to find themselves in a ghost town that had been abandoned for decades. Rotting buildings leaned against each other like drunken men, their windows empty as the eye sockets of skulls. But it was the perfect place for what Jack knew had to happen, a final confrontation between truth and lies, between justice and greed, between the living and the dead. "Silas will follow us here," Jack said, helping Eliza down from Luna's back. "He can't afford to let us reach Silver Creek with that journal." "Good," Eliza replied, her voice still carrying those otherworldly harmonics. "It's time this ended where it began, in a place where innocent blood was spilled for silver." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses reached them from the direction of the cave. Silas Crow and his remaining men were emerging from the mountain, their torches bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Jack counted at least 8 riders, all armed and desperate enough to kill anyone who threatened their carefully constructed lies. "We can't outrun them," Jack said grimly, checking his rifle. "Luna's carrying too much weight, and we're running out of ammunition." "We're not running anymore," Eliza said with quiet certainty. "This is where we make our stand." She began removing the sacred artifacts from Luna's back, arranging them in a wide circle in the center of the abandoned town square. The war lance she planted upright in the dusty ground, its eagle feathers stirring in a wind that seemed to blow from another world. The medicine bag she placed reverently beside a carved stone that had marked Cherokee territory for 1,000 years before white men ever set foot in this valley. As each artifact found its place, the air itself seemed to thicken with power. The silver bracelets on Eliza's wrists pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, coyotes began to howl, not with hunger, but with the ancient song of souls calling to their ancestors. "Jack," Eliza said softly, "whatever happens in the next few minutes, I want you to know something. My grandmother's journal wasn't just about exposing Silas Crow's crimes. It was about finding someone worthy to carry on the fight for justice, someone who'd lost as much as we have, but hadn't lost their honor." Jack met her eyes, seeing in them not just the frightened young woman he'd rescued from a burning cross, but the accumulated wisdom and determination of generations of Cherokee women who'd fought to protect their people. "Your grandmother chose well," he said simply. The first riders appeared at the edge of town, their horses snorting and shying at the supernatural energy crackling through the air. Silas Crow rode at their head, his expensive coat now torn and dirty from the pursuit through the caves, but his eyes burned with the same cold determination that had driven him to murder 20 years ago. "End of the line, Harlan," Silas called out, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. No more running. No more hiding. You've got something that belongs to me, and I mean to have it back. You mean the Cherokee artifacts you stole from sacred burial grounds? Jack replied, stepping into the circle of relics with his rifle ready. Or do you mean the truth about how you murdered a dozen innocent miners to cover up your grave robbing? Silas's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Truth is whatever the man with the most guns says it is, and I've got enough firepower here to write history any way I choose. His men spread out in a rough semicircle, their weapons trained on Jack and Eliza. But something was wrong. Their horses were becoming increasingly agitated, rolling their eyes and fighting their bits as if sensing danger their human riders couldn't perceive. That's when the Cherokee spirits made their final appearance. They rose from the very earth itself this time, dozens of ghostly figures emerging from ground that had been soaked with their blood over 3 centuries of conflict. Warriors and chiefs, medicine men and mothers, carrying children, all bearing the wounds of their violent deaths, but radiating a power that made the air itself crackle with electricity. At their head stood Princess Atsila, no longer translucent, but blazing with silver fire that turned night into day. She raised her hand, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of every Cherokee soul that had ever called this land home. "Enough," she said, and the word hit Silas's men like a physical blow. 3 of them turned and fled immediately, their horses bolting toward the distant horizon. The others fought to control their mounts, their faces white with terror as they found themselves confronting forces beyond their comprehension. But Silas himself seemed immune to supernatural fear. His greed had grown so large, his evil so complete, that even the judgment of the dead couldn't shake his determination to destroy anyone who threatened his power. "Ghosts don't stop bullets," he snarled, raising his revolver toward Eliza. "And I've killed enough people to know that the dead stay dead when you put them in the ground properly." He fired, the muzzle flash blooming like a deadly flower in the darkness. But the bullet never reached its target. Instead, it struck Princess Atzila's upraised hand and simply stopped, frozen in midair like a metal bee trapped in invisible amber. "The silver remembers," Atzila said, her ancient eyes boring into Silas's soul. "Every drop of blood spilled to claim it, every life sacrificed to possess it, every sacred thing destroyed to reach it." The bullet began to glow, heating up until it was white hot. Then it reversed direction, flying back toward the man who'd fired it with twice the speed and 10 times the purpose. Silas threw himself sideways, the bullet missing him by inches and burying itself in the wooden wall behind him. But the supernatural ricochet was just the beginning. All around the circle of artifacts, the spirits were gathering power, drawing strength from 3 centuries of accumulated injustice. The very air began to vibrate with energy that made Jack's teeth ache and turned Eliza's silver bracelets into miniature suns. "Go deeper," the spirits said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that human throats could never produce. "Make it quick inside. The blood debt must be paid." That's when Jack understood the true meaning of his wife's final words. She hadn't been talking about mining at all. She'd been giving him instructions passed down through Sarah Thorne, who'd received them from the Cherokee spirits themselves. Instructions about how to reach the deepest truth, how to strike quickly at the heart of evil, how to make justice swift and certain. "Silas!" Jack called out, his voice cutting through the supernatural chorus. 20 years ago, you murdered my wife and 11 other innocent people. You stole sacred artifacts from Cherokee burial grounds. You've spent 2 decades covering up your crimes with more murder and corruption." He stepped forward, his rifle trained on the man who'd destroyed so many lives. "I'm not here for revenge anymore. I'm here for justice." Silas raised his gun again, but his hand was shaking now. "Justice? I made this town prosperous. I brought civilization to this God-forsaken wilderness. Everything I did for progress." "You did it for greed," Eliza said, the Cherokee spirits flowing around her like a river of silver light. "And now the ancestors you dishonored have come to collect what you owe them." The final confrontation lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours in the supernatural twilight that had descended over the abandoned town. Silas fired wild, his shots going wide as Princess Atzila's power disrupted his aim. Jack's single bullet, guided by 20 years of accumulated grief and the combined will of every Cherokee spirit in the circle, found its mark with surgical precision. Silas Crow fell to his knees in the dusty street, his gun tumbling from nerveless fingers. As his life ebbed away, his eyes fixed on the Cherokee artifacts surrounding him, sacred objects he'd stolen and sold, spiritual treasures he'd treated as common merchandise, the accumulated heritage of a people he'd tried to destroy. The silver, he whispered with his last breath. It was all for the silver. And now the silver returns to where it belongs, Princess Atsila said gently, her form already beginning to fade as justice was finally served. The surviving members of Silas's gang scattered into the night, their leader's death breaking whatever hold greed and fear had maintained over them. As dawn broke over the abandoned mining camp, only Jack and Eliza remained in the circle of sacred artifacts, watching the Cherokee spirits fade back into the realm of the ancestors. Is it over? Eliza asked, the supernatural energy finally leaving her voice. This part is, Jack replied, helping her to her feet. But there's still work to do. Marshal Wade needs to see that journal, and those artifacts need to be returned to Cherokee sacred ground. As they loaded the relics back onto Luna's patient back, Eliza felt the weight of her grandmother's mission settling onto her shoulders. Sarah Thorne had spent her life documenting injustice and preserving the truth. Now it was Eliza's turn to make sure that truth was heard by those with the power to act on it. But as they rode away from the ghost town towards Silver Creek and Marshal Wade's office, both knew that something profound had changed. The curse of Millbrook Canyon was broken, not by supernatural forces alone, but by the courage of ordinary people who chose to stand up for what was right. And somewhere in the morning wind that sang through the canyon, those who listened carefully might have heard the whisper of Cherokee voices, finally at peace after 3 centuries of waiting for justice. The blood silver had been redeemed, the ancestors could rest, and the truth, at long last, would set them all free. And that, my friends, is how the curse of Millbrook Canyon was finally broken. Not by ancient magic or supernatural forces alone, but by the unbreakable power of truth and the courage of ordinary people who refused to let injustice stand. Jack Harlan discovered that some ghosts aren't spirits at all, but the weight of buried secrets that eat away at a man's soul until he has the courage to dig them up and face them in the light. And Eliza Thorne learned that her grandmother's greatest gift wasn't just a silver bracelet, but a legacy of determination that transformed a frightened young woman into a guardian of justice that even death couldn't silence. The real story here isn't about cursed jewelry or vengeful spirits. It's about something far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous than any supernatural force. It's about what happens when greed becomes so consuming that a man will murder innocents to protect his profits. It's about the lies we tell ourselves when facing the truth seems too hard, too costly, too dangerous to our comfortable lives. And it's about the incredible courage it takes to stand up and say, no more, when everyone around you is choosing the easy path of silence. Marshal Thomas Wade didn't just arrest the surviving members of Silas Crow's gang when Jack and Eliza reached Silver Creek that morning. He spent the next 3 months unraveling 20 years of corruption, using Sarah Thorne's meticulous journal to expose a network of illegal mining operations, stolen land deals, and covered-up murders that stretched across 3 territories. The Cherokee artifacts were returned to the tribal elders in a ceremony that brought tears to the eyes of hardened frontier lawmen, and the sacred burial grounds were finally restored to their rightful guardians. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the territorial governor officially pardoned Sarah Thorne's name and declared her a hero of the Cherokee Nation. The woman who'd spent 20 years in exile, branded as a coward for surviving when others died, was finally recognized for what she truly was. A warrior who'd fought for justice with the only weapons she had, truth, patience, and an unshakable belief that right would eventually triumph over might. Jack Harlan never went back to his cabin in the hills. Instead, he took a job as deputy marshal under Thomas Wade, using his knowledge of the territory and his hard-earned understanding of human nature to hunt down the kind of men who preyed on the innocent. The Ghost Rider became something far more dangerous to the wicked, a lawman who'd seen the worst that greed and fear could do and was determined to make sure it never happened again on his watch. Eliza Thorne stayed in Silver Creek, opening a school that taught both white and Cherokee children side by side, something that had never been done in that part of the territory. She kept her grandmother's journal, but not as a secret to be hidden. Instead, she used it as a textbook, teaching the next generation about the real history of their land, about the price of injustice, and about the power that ordinary people possess when they choose courage over comfort. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right through the canyon, some folks swear they could still hear voices carried on the breeze. Not the angry cries of restless spirits, but the gentle whispers of ancestors finally at peace, blessing the land they died to protect. You see, that's the real lesson of this tale from the Old West. Curses aren't supernatural forces that strike us down from beyond the grave. Curses are the lies we tell ourselves when we're too afraid to face hard truths. They're the secrets we bury so deep we forget they exist, until they poison everything around them. They're the injustices we ignore because dealing with them seems too difficult, too dangerous, too likely to disrupt our comfortable lives. But here's what Jack and Eliza discovered, and what you need to remember long after this story ends. Truth has a power all its own. It might stay buried for 20 years or 50 or even 100, but eventually it finds a way to the surface. Eventually, someone with enough courage and enough love for justice will pick up the shovel and start digging. And when that happens, no amount of money, no amount of influence, no amount of fear can keep the truth from blazing forth like silver fire. Maybe you're carrying your own buried truth right now. Maybe there's something in your past, something in your family history, something in your community that everyone knows but nobody talks about. Maybe you've been telling yourself it's too late to make a difference, that the people with power will never listen, that fighting for what's right will only bring you trouble. If that's you, if you're struggling with whether to speak up or stay silent, remember Jack Harlan sitting on that ridge for 20 years, watching injustice happen and telling himself there was nothing he could do. Remember the moment he finally decided that some fights are worth having, even when the odds seem impossible. Remember that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Your truth might not involve Cherokee burial grounds or stolen silver. It might be as simple as standing up to a bully, speaking out against corruption in your workplace, or refusing to participate in the kind of casual cruelty that destroys people's spirits one small cut at a time. But whatever form your truth takes, whatever injustice you're facing, remember that you're not alone. Every person who's ever fought for what's right, every voice that's ever been raised against oppression, every soul that's ever chosen courage over comfort is standing with you in spirit, because that's the real magic, the real power that broke the curse of Millbrook Canyon. Not supernatural forces, but the decision of ordinary people to become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. The choice to stand up rather than stand aside, to speak truth rather than comfortable lies, to fight for justice even when justice seems impossible to achieve. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that good people can make a difference when they find the courage to try, then don't let that feeling fade like morning mist. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that matter, stories that remind us who we can be when we're at our best. Share this tale with someone who needs to hear about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the whole world seems arrayed against you. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you tales from the frontier that prove the human spirit is stronger than any curse, deeper than any secret, and more powerful than any force that stands against justice. These aren't just stories about the Old West. They're stories about the eternal struggle between right and wrong, between courage and cowardice, between the people who build and the people who destroy. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time you had to choose between staying silent and speaking truth. Share this story with someone who's fighting their own battle against injustice. And remember, in this wild frontier we call life, heroes aren't born. They're made by the choices they make when everything seems darkest and the right path seems hardest to walk. Until our trails cross again, keep riding toward the light, keep fighting for the truth, and remember that every legend starts with one person deciding that enough is enough. This has been Wild West Stories, where every tale reminds us that the most powerful force in the universe isn't magic or money or might. It's the unbreakable human spirit choosing to do what's right, no matter the cost. Keep your silver bright, your conscience clear, and your courage strong. We'll see you on the next trail, partner.